I'm Stan Grant. Welcome to 1+1. I'm here at the Belvoir Theatre in Sydney, where a playwright, Cody Bedford, has just performed her first play. Now, this is a play that absolutely treads on all the sensitivities of our identity age. It is a play that steps on so many landmines, and that's exactly what Cody wanted to do. She was a journalist, she's a writer, she's a storyteller. Just don't call her an Aboriginal storyteller.
Cody Bedford, and welcome to the final episode of Message Stick. Here on the outskirts of Yarrabah, police regularly set up checkpoints to inspect cars going into the community. Scientists chose here on Wadjuri country to be the site of the new Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder telescope.
Cody Bedford, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you.
This is the question I ask everyone at the start of this series. Who are you?
Well, I'd just say I'm a storyteller. I like yarns, I like yarning, and here I am, a storyteller.
Now that says a lot. It's interesting that you say a storyteller, because other people may say you're an Indigenous storyteller. You specifically didn't say that.
I mean, that's something I've struggled with a long time. I started out...
You and me both.
Yes. Well, you would know. I started out as a journalist, and it was straight away Indigenous journalist. And as I moved through every job role, it's always been Indigenous assistant, Indigenous writer, Indigenous screenwriter. And I just thought, you know, my peers never get white writer, white journalist, and that really, it made me feel small in a way.
That's a really interesting way of seeing it, isn't it? That it makes you, what makes you feel small about that?
It just made me feel like there straight away, that's your identity, and like even being an Indigenous journalist, that you have to report on Indigenous things. Of course I'm passionate about Indigenous issues. I am a proud blackfella. I have a really big family, but I'm also passionate about other things. I remember my first story at SBS where I got to tell, I think it was just a little VO on an election in the Middle East, and that for me just blew my mind. Like having that, to do that, I'm finally not just an Indigenous journalist.
That was the most liberating thing for me. And when I came into journalism, there was no one else.
No.
You know, I'm there. This is more than
you paved the way for me, Stan.
This is more than 30 years ago. Well, if I'm paving the way, it may be a very rocky road, believe me. But look, I came into it, and of course, like you said, I'm Indigenous. I mean, that's what I am. I can't think of myself in any other way. But like you, I didn't want to be defined that way. It was going overseas, and it was doing other things and engaging with other people that liberated me, just as you said.
Yeah, I mean, I fought against that box, but yet I didn't have the confidence to fight against it. And it also made me feel like you had to be grateful. You be grateful. You're in this role because you're Indigenous, where I think that took away all the hard work I did, and all the hard work, you know, my ancestors did, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. The reason they worked hard is so I could get here, basically. You know, last night my uncle rang me and he's like, oh, you know, the reason why we are where we are as a black family is in 1937, your great-great-grandfather dropped off your great-grandmother to Moola Mission and said, educate my kids. And that changed the course of our family and changed the course of where I am, because my great-grandmother, I remember her, she was always like, education first, education first. And it wasn't because of black fella or white fella way, it was just get educated and, I don't know, go take over the world. But to me, especially in 1937, where they had to ask for permission from the protector of Aborigines, that's amazing. They didn't do it because they were Indigenous kids. They just did it because they wanted to be equal and Australian.
And yet, Cody, here you are, I am. We're still having this conversation, still fighting these battles. And I know what that word means. I know when people say you're the Indigenous playwright or the Indigenous journalist or the Indigenous doctor or the Indigenous lawyer. It comes with all those assumptions. It comes with assumptions about what you'll be interested in. It does diminish you because it makes your success, your achievement conditional. Conditional on someone else's kindness, someone else has created an opportunity for you. That box is just, it's suffocating, that box.
It is, and it was around, I guess, when I finally broke into screenwriting, where I just changed my mentality and I just went, what would a middle-aged white man do? And it changed my life, even from the point of asking for things. Can I have that office, or can I get a late checkout in the hotel room? Just asking for things and going, no, I'm not here because I'm Indigenous. I'm here because I work hard and I'm talented as a writer. I can tell stories, and I celebrate the success as an Indigenous woman, of course. But yeah, don't diminish me because of what I've achieved.
You jumped ahead there because it wasn't just, oh, I'll leave journalism and I'll become a playwright. It was a hard road, and you know, we can have a laugh and we can talk about, you know, the silliness of those assumptions, but those assumptions erode your sense of self-worth. They can be psychologically damaging, and it did that to you, didn't it? It took an enormous toll on you when people would define you in that way or marginalise you in that way.
Yeah, I mean, coming over, I was so naive as a 23-year-old coming from Western Australia. I mean, I got the call from SBS saying, you're moving to Sydney, come next week. And it just happened so fast, where I came over in such a naive state of mind and I was really excited. But then, yeah, the box, being in that box, and it was suffocating, and everyone just, from doing voice coaching, the way you speak, Cody, change the way you speak. Our audiences won't hear you, or you can't articulate things that way. Don't say Australia, say Australia. And to this day, I still say Australia because it's been trained into me. But it got suffocating to the point I had some of my darkest days working as a journo, and of course, covering stories where, you know, you're covering very traumatic stories. And the workplace felt toxic. And it's not just SBS, it's any workplace I've been in, actually, looking back, from SBS to ABC, dealt with exactly the same issues. And I guess my self-worth just went so downhill. Like, I am lucky to be here. I'm lucky to be sitting here today, because there's a few other choices I would have made, I wouldn't be here today.
So you really did feel like you know, taking your own life may have been preferable to dealing with those pressures.
Yeah, twice. There was 2 times. I even planned out a route to the Gap, you know, to go, I'm out of here. I can't take this. And being away from home as well, and away from your family, being a WA girl, it just felt so isolating. Where's my support? Where's my support group? And I fought it like all night, and I woke up with the sun, and it was magical. I'm like, I'm here today, I'm moving on.
I'm really sorry to hear that, Cody, because I know where that comes from, because trying to navigate that world, coming from where we come from, navigating what can be a hostile space, it is absolutely not easy. And when people talk about things like racism, and we debate what that word even means, it does eat your soul. It does. It absolutely, it can destroy you. And it does push you to those limits, doesn't it?
Yeah, I wasn't even aware it was happening. Of course, when depression takes hold, it's all about, you're worthless, you did this, it's all your fault. But I look back now where I'm in a really great spot, and I go, fuck, like, it was all these other things around me that just eroded me. The racism, the paternalism, how they just treat, Aboriginal people from a day-to-day basis. But I wasn't aware of that because, of course, that's not who I don't define myself as just an Aboriginal journalist or Aboriginal writer. But looking back now, it was definitely, as people shoved you into the box, it does have a big toll on your mental health, basically.
Can I tell you, I had the same thing. Living away from home, and I lived outside of Australia for almost 20 years. And I wanted to do that. That was a journey that I embraced. But to be away from your family and be away from those things and your culture, which is really important to you, but also to carry the trauma that we do inherit, and it is part of who we are. And I was reporting other traumatic events. I was reporting war. I was spending time amongst people who'd lost everything in the world, people in refugee camps, and inevitably I saw something of myself in that. And it did have the same effect on me, to the same extent of wondering how I could go on, having that feeling of wanting to take your own life, of having that deep depression. And I was saying, to my wife, and later having to get help for that. It was all of that stuff. It was from childhood to then. It wasn't just traumatic stress from war. It was all of that. And I think that's what you're describing as well.
Oh, absolutely.
It was all that you inherited. It was all that you lived with, and all of it coming to a head at a time when you should have actually been celebrating success.
I came into Sydney and I was I am aware that I was actually a really good writer, but my confidence...
And we should be able to say that.
Yeah.
We should be able to say we're good at that.
We totally should celebrate that, but being chipped away, and it wasn't just that. I reckon exactly what you said. I can go back to my childhood. My earliest memory is of pure violence, of hiding in a cupboard when a male relative is walking around with a knife and just cowering and hoping, am I going to survive? My next childhood memory was a man knocking at the door and attacking my mum. He was a down rapist. And just all those things, I look back and I go, fuck, I shouldn't have survived. I shouldn't be here right now, sitting here in Sydney. But somehow, something within me, and I put it down to my imagination, imagining something bigger, something better. Like hiding in that cupboard, I was constantly imagining, and it's a survival mechanism, but it helped me survive, and it's made me a writer in the end. That's how I've actually got through, is through art, basically.
And all of that, Cody, is about wanting to live outside of other people's boxes. And yet, this is something that maybe other Australians don't appreciate. And I'm acutely aware, and from listening to what you're saying, that you're very conscious of this, is every time we fill out a form, any form, we can be joining a gym, enrolling in a class, filling out a home loan, there is a box. Are you Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Now, I understand the reasons for ticking the box. It collects data and so on. Fine. There is a deeper psychological impact of being in that box. My grandmother's not in that box. My mother's mother, who's a white Australian, lived with us, married an Aboriginal man, or lived with an Aboriginal man. They couldn't even get married. If she's not part of that box, what am I doing ticking that box? Do you have the same issues about actively ticking a box and assertively saying, I am this and only this?
Yeah, I do have that. And it's got to the point where sometimes I think I'm only hired because I'm Aboriginal, and it ticks a box for someone. And I'm trying to get my mentality around, like, no, it's actually because you are good at what you do. But that's really hard to do. And I guess my mother is a white fella, my dad is a black fella. But growing up in WA, it's weird to say I never experienced any identity issues, because even my white side recognised that I was a black fella. It was normal, black and white in Geraldton, WA. All my school peers recognised that. Coming over to New South Wales, it's such a big conversation of identity here, and it really suddenly I'm getting asked these questions like, well, who are you? And oh, you can't say your mum's white, or, you know, don't...
Even having to prove you're Aboriginal.
Yeah, prove you're Aboriginal. And I just thought, it's not to say that, you know, going back to WA is like a homecoming, because going back, it's also like, oh, well, who do you think you are now? You think you're good now, living a big Sydney life. So it's just kind of like, whoa, where am I? I miss home, but home won't accept me sometimes. Sydney won't accept me sometimes, the East Coast. And it's kind of been the last 10 years about finding out who I am. And I've just landed on, you're a writer. That's what you've always done to survive things. Do it.
I've always been living in that in-between space, which I find really fascinating, actually. And that's me. I have European ancestry, I have Aboriginal ancestry. I know that I'm still an Aboriginal person, I'm a Wiradjuri, Gamaroi, Dharawal person, I know that. But I've always been attracted to those writers. Toni Morrison once said, you know, the African-American writer, she said that her struggle was to live free as a writer in a wholly racialised, sexualised, genderised world. James Baldwin, who went to France and said he went to France because he did not want to be a Negro, let alone a Negro writer, you know, using the language of the time. He didn't say, I didn't want to be black. How could he not be black? He didn't want other people's assumptions. And then James Joyce, the great Irish writer, who said that, you know, he went in search of the unconstructed conscience of his race. He wanted to be free of the history and the grievance of Ireland and Irish Catholicism. That's interesting to me. It isn't a repudiation of who you are, but it's interesting for you. What do you explore in that grey area? What draws you to that?
That's really interesting question, because writing this play, Cursed, for Belvoir, it was anxiety-inducing, mainly because it wasn't your typical Aboriginal play. And when I say Aboriginal play, what kind of white audiences or theatre audiences expect of an Aboriginal play? I wanted just to have a multicultural family, something I grew up with, and make that normal, and not really mention race, but explore more deeper issues like grief and family issues. And the anxiety that came from that, because I'm like, I'm breaking out of the box here. It's a really risky thing to do, because I was most concerned like that the blackfellow community would reject me. Well, who does she think she is putting on this play? Of course they didn't, but and then of course the theatre audiences figuring out, oh, what is this play? Why? I've had comments like, why don't these actors look like each other, because they are from different heritages, yet that's just actors. No actor looks like each other, well, unless you're casting really well and casting within a family. But I found that a really odd comment, and would that comment be made if it was two unrelated white actors? Like, the goal was to put a multicultural family on stage, because that's what I grew up with. I grew up with Japanese cousins, I grew up with Maltese cousins, I grew up with English cousins, I grew up with my blackfella cousins, who I regard as like my siblings. And so it was just normal to me to have that on stage, and I couldn't understand why other plays or TV shows weren't doing that, because as far as I'm aware, all of us come from different, the Australian story to me is that we all come from different places. I come from different places, you know, even on my black side, I've got a huge Irish connection to the Durack family, who were like empire, it was an empire, cattle empire in the Kimberley. And I feel like we don't do that enough in Australian stories. And it absolutely is an Australian story to come from all these different places. And for me to put that on the stage, it shouldn't really be a conversation, but yet it is.
And even having this conversation, I'm aware that we're having this as two Aboriginal people, but people who we're also treading on landmines, even having the conversation. And you said something before about when you came to New South Wales and suddenly it was all about this and proving you're Aboriginal, and you can't say you have a white mother,
Yeah.
you know, all of these things. We have to be honest that a lot of the pushback we get is from our own. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it really breaks my heart, this like lateral violence, they call it, of taking down. But it's also when people go, oh, you're not Aboriginal enough. It shocks you, like, well, I've never known any other life. So what am I? If you like to go to the Kimberley and talk to my family, they'll have other words for you. But yeah, it's such a weird mindset of what you can and can't do as an Aboriginal person. It's almost to the point like you cannot have another political view as an Aboriginal person, which is worrying because you know you cannot write any other thing as an Aboriginal person, and that just, it makes life boring, doesn't it? Really.
Are you sensitive to that when you write? Do you write with those, you know, voices whispering in your ear, Cody, you can't say this, Cody, you can't write this, Cody, you know, this is not black?
I wrote at the top of my script, I said, if you're offended by anything in this play, do not blame the writer, blame the character. Because it all comes from them. And I feel like that's the way I get out. That's my get out of jail free card. Of course, it's as I come out of writing and I look at it and I go, wow, that's really problematic. I have a scene where I have a Chinese character yell a slur, a really racist slur at the Aboriginal character. And looking back, I'm like, actually, I really wanted that. I really wanted that because you never see Asian Australians participate in racism, in Australian racism. And that is absurd of me to say, and I'll probably get cancelled for saying just that. But you never do, because it's always, you want your minorities to be perfect. We're not perfect. We slag each other off. We're all doing the same thing. It's human. That is a human thing to do, that this tribalism. So I wanted that in a sort of meta way. It made her Australian. It didn't make her Chinese. It made her Australian by doing that. I was really, it's odd to say, I was really proud of that racial slur in the play because it said so much.
And yet words have power and they come from somewhere. And to this extent, I understand what we now call identity politics. I understand that it comes from a place of historical powerlessness. I understand that it is a statement of a systemic and deeply, deeply systematic racism in a society that we've talked about even during this interview. I understand absolutely the historical, power that comes and supports a systemic racist society. How do we walk that line of wanting to be free, demanding the right to speak and write about whatever, but at the same time knowing that we cannot separate ourselves from our history and the politics and the power that history and politics has created?
I mean, I don't claim to have any answers to any of that, Stan, but I look back at my family history and some of the things they survived. I have a great-great-great-grandfather who was known as King of the Desert before white people came in the Kimberley. We can trace our line confidently back there. And yet, on my white side, I have a family who came over for the gold rush. Like, isn't that like the most Australian thing and Australian story? And so I don't know how to write anything other than that.
I look at a lot of Aboriginal literature or plays, and I find myself often frustrated with this narrative that is quite often about going in search or going back or rediscovering or trying to claim some authenticity. And I look at that and I often say, but actually it's messier than that.
Yeah.
I don't need to go back to find anything. I want to live with all of the glorious complexity and craziness of a world where we don't live in those boxes. But it is a recurring motif, isn't it? It is a recurring narrative. And I understand where it comes from, but it is a recurring narrative. How do you feel about that narrative of reclaiming, going back, finding something to attach yourself to a moment that gives you a sense of authenticity? Do you need that in your life?
I get sent a lot of scripts from white producers that go, oh, can you help me with this? It's about an Aboriginal person in search of their culture. And that's not the story I want to tell. And like, maybe it's for someone else. That's not me. That's not the audience I want to be a part of. And I look back at the history of Australian film where, you know, we had all the way from Jeddah, which really was like the first like coloured person I'd seen on screen, and then to like Rabbit Proof Fence, which was done by a white director, Radiance, Rachel Perkins, and then you've got things like Sweet Country, Warwick Thornton, and that narrative is always like banging on history. And that is so important because Australia hasn't reconciled with the true history of what happened here. For me, and I think this generation of filmmakers, because those stories have been made, it enables us to go, all right, we want to start looking forward at what Aboriginal characters can do now. And I think that's the point we're at, where people still want us in that box of telling those historical stories, and this new generation coming up going, but we want to tell Aboriginals in space. Like, wouldn't that be amazing? I pitched that story, by the way, and it didn't... The feedback I got was, what's Aboriginal about it? And that made me go, well...
We've got problems.
Yeah, we've got a long way to go. So maybe in 5 years' time we'll be ready for Blackfellas in space, just being silly. So it's hard when you've got an industry, and a proud industry of Australian filmmakers, who all they know is those historical Aboriginal films. And we're fighting down the doors at the moment to go, actually, we've got a new story to tell. We're past that now. We've told those stories, magnificently so, because we are the best storytellers in the world. Now let's go forward.
Well, I look forward to seeing Blackfellas in space. Cody Bedford, storyteller. Thank you so much for talking to us on 1+1. It's been a real delight. I've loved it. Thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Stan.